Welcome to our bonus From Opinion to Insight. Today, we're sort of placing a historical mirror in front of our own perceptions. We'll be exploring the really profound evolution of how Europe has viewed the human body, gender, and sexuality across different eras.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey we're tracing. Our mission really is to follow this path laid out in our source material. We'll go from prehistory through classical antiquity, the Middle Ages, early modern times, modern, and right up to contemporary times. And, get ready, because we're going to uncover some, genuinely surprising facts and some really profound shifts that I think will definitely challenge how you might understand these things today.
Absolutely. So to kick off this journey, let's step way back to classical antiquity, and let's shine that historical mirror on a really key ancient voice, alias Galenus. We're talking around 129 to 210 AD. Galenus introduced what's now known as the one-sex model.
Right. And this was a really pervasive belief. The core idea was that women were fundamentally imperfect versions of men.
Imperfect versions.
Well, it's quite remarkable, actually, the detail he went into. Galenus basically asserted women were less perfect because they were inherently colder and less active than males. And he had this whole intricate anatomical explanation for it. He suggested female body parts were internal because they could not, due to the defect in the heat, come out.
Wait, so because they weren't hot enough, their organs stayed inside?
Essentially, yes. The implication was that female organs were simply inward-turned male organs. So, for instance, the uterus was seen as what the scrotum would have become if it had developed externally with enough heat. Okay,
so cooler, internalized versions of men. That's quite a perspective. But surely he didn't just leave it at defect, right? Did he see any kind of, advantage to this difference?
He did, actually, which is interesting. He framed it as an advantage for the race. His argument went something like this. Female coldness allowed them to retain nutrients for the fetus, whereas a perfectly warm male body, you see, would easily spread and evaporate all those vital resources. He even thought female testicles were smaller, less perfect, producing sperm that was cleaner, colder, and wetter, and incapable of procreation on its own.
This is where it gets really thought-provoking, isn't it? Because, yes, it strikes us immediately as discriminatory, like women are deficient, but at the same time, it sort of implies this shared biological essence, the same fundamental parts, just arranged differently. It's almost this weird kind of biological equality of, shared building blocks.
That's a really insightful way to put it. And this idea, this one-sex model, it wasn't just some obscure theory. It was incredibly enduring. If you look across history, you see Galenus' concepts popping up in anatomical drawings centuries later, even to the 16th and 17th centuries. You look at figures like Vesalius in 1543.
Vesalius, right, the famous anatomist.
Exactly. And Vidius in 1611, their illustrations, even then, continued to show female reproductive organs as basically internalized male ones. It really demonstrates how deeply ingrained Galenus' model was. It shaped the visual understanding of the body for a very long time, well into the early modern period.
And it wasn't just the drawings, was it? It influenced thinking more broadly. Galenus' ideas kept shaping Christian Western thought right through the Middle Ages, didn't they? Just reinforcing this single view of sex for centuries.
Then comes the Enlightenment, which we think of as this period of great scientific inquiry. Though it's worth noting, a lot of that inquiry often ended up, maybe unintentionally, reconfirming the existing social orders, but it is in this era that we start seeing a really significant shift, a move towards a two-sex model. And hormones were key.
Hormones, right. And the scientist, he had this really vivid way of describing it, didn't he? He called it a chemical war between the male and the female hormones. Almost like a chemical miniature of the well-known eternal war between men and women. Sounds pretty dramatic for biology.
It really does capture the sense of revolution, I think. Ernst Lacour and Nellie Udshorn, they detail this new model of sex where sex differences get pinned directly on hormones. But here's the crucial bit, as Udshorn points out. These hormones are present in female as well as male bodies.
Okay, that's the kicker. Hormones in both sexes. So it's not like, men have male hormones and women have female hormones completely separate.
Not according to this new model, no. It suggests more of a shared chemical foundation, maybe different balances, but not entirely distinct categories. And this leads to Udshorn's really profound insight. She says, and I'm quoting loosely here, how science gives meaning to sex differences is thus partly shaped by cultural notions of masculinity and femininity. She argues scientists actually use cultural notions as one of their cognitive resources.
Wow. That really challenges the idea of science being totally objective, doesn't it? That culture itself can actually sculpt how science interprets things. Can you give an example of how that might have worked back then?
Sure. Well, think about the expected gender roles of the time. If society strongly believed women were, say, naturally more nurturing or emotional, scientists, perhaps unconsciously, might have been more likely to look for hormonal explanations that fit that idea, even if the raw data could have been interpreted differently. Or maybe, if male aggression was seen as a positive, culturally valued trait, research might have focused heavily on finding its hormonal basis, maybe overlooking other factors or nuances. It just shows how scientists, being human and part of their culture, can frame questions and see results through that lens.
That makes a lot of sense. It shows how powerful these cultural constructions can be. Which brings us to Yves Sarfati. He basically concludes that the whole idea of two distinct sexes, the dimorphic sex category, is a cultural construction, thousands of years old.
And then he makes this really striking point. He says, our modern tools, biological measurement tools, developed pretty recently, less than 50 years ago. These tools are now actively challenging that ancient dichotomy. He even boldly claims that, biologically speaking, nothing in biology today justifies maintaining the ancient dichotomy.
That is bold. A real disconnect between the biology as we understand it now and these deep-seated social categories. And Sarfati uses that analogy, doesn't he? About the Earth orbiting the sun.
He does. He compares the difficulty of letting go of these certainties about sex to the historical resistance people had to accepting heliocentrism. He calls it an eternal story of a slap given to human pride. It just highlights how incredibly hard it is to shift concepts that have been foundational for, millennia, even when new evidence comes along.
Okay, so moving into the modern period, we start seeing the tangible impacts of these views, especially with the rise of medicalization. And here's a piece of trivia that just blew my mind. The vibrator. It was the fifth electrical household appliance invented, 1889. That's before vacuum cleaners, before electric irons.
It's a great bit of trivia, isn't it? And it connects directly back to that evolving two-sex model and the sort of attempts to understand and control female sexuality. Because initially, the vibrator was used by doctors to treat hysteria.
Hysteria, right. That catch-all diagnosis for women back then.
Exactly. But its invention, even framed medically like that, suggests something deeper, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Like, even though it was medicalized, maybe pathologized, its very existence points to this underlying, maybe unconscious need or reality of female sexual experience, female pleasure.
A kind of hidden emancipation, perhaps.
Yeah, even if it was wrapped up in medical jargon. And this whole era was just steeped in sexual repression, wasn't it? Especially for women. But then, swinging the pendulum, we find something called gender play, particularly the 18th century, which sounds quite different. There are poems from the time, like one by Henry Fielding in 1743. He describes women almost astride, looking more like dragoons than maids, wearing fierce cocked hats.
Yeah, and another poem, The Adulteress, from 1773, it sort of laments the loss of these older types of women, the matrons of Queen Bess, who were supposedly rough as their lords, as honest and as hale. It hints at this nostalgia, maybe, for a time when gender roles felt less rigid, less strictly defined. There seemed to be room for more playful expression.
And this playfulness wasn't just in poems, right? It was happening in real life, in places like the Molly houses.
Exactly. The Molly houses of the 18th century were these fascinating spaces, almost literal theaters of gender play for men. Accounts from the time, like about Margaret Clapp's place or Gabriel Lawrence's description. They're incredibly vivid. They talk about men making love to one another, sitting in each other's laps, mimicking women's language.
Right, with phrases like, "Oh, sir, pray, sir, dear sir, Lord, how can you serve me so?" It sounds incredibly theatrical and performative. They even staged mock marriages.
It really paints a picture of a subculture actively playing with and performing different gender roles. But of course, this kind of fluidity, this gender play, it didn't go unnoticed or unchallenged. It provoked a backlash, gender panic.
Gender panic, okay.
Yeah. And the fact that Margaret Clapp herself was prosecuted for keeping a Molly house, that perfectly illustrates this growing societal anxiety, this pushback. And this panic, this anxiety, it directly fed into the increasing pathologization of homosexuality, turning it from play into a medical condition.
Right, and this is where someone like Richard von Krufft-Ebing comes in with his Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886. He's defining the homosexual man in these very specific medicalized terms, attracted only to male dancers, athletes, statues. Finding female charm leaves him cold.
And it gets quite chilling when you look at the case histories, like his case history 169, a patient diagnosed with contrary sexual instinct acquired by masturbation and subjected to hypnosis with these awful suggestions, commands like basically to test love for your own sex, fall in love with a virtuous woman. It just starkly shows the attempt to medically cure something that perhaps wasn't seen as an illness before.
Such a shift. And this increasing rigidity in gender roles, you really see it reflected in how people looked in fashion and art, especially in the 19th century. You mentioned James Tissett's paintings, The Political Lady. The female dress is just so elaborate, so constraining.
A really distinct female aesthetic. And contrast that with how male beauty was treated. Witkowski and Nass, they note that, yeah, male beauty is acknowledged, but the men are always strictly and neatly dressed. But for women, no, their beautiful charms, the breasts, they were actually required viewing in décolletage for the theater, for balls. This super rigid distinction just hammered home that two-sex model and really limited how people could express gender or sexuality.
Okay, let's shift that historical mirror slightly now toward the male ideal, especially in art and politics. Jacques-Louis David's paintings from the late 18th century, the intervention of the Sabine women, they really capture this emerging ideal, don't they? Strength, civic virtue, stoicism, often that heroic classical body type.
Absolutely. And this links perfectly to Gerhard Lachmann-Moss's theory about the creation of modern masculinity. He argues this archetype, blending strength and ascetic appeal, whether it was presented as restrained and compassionate or uncompromising and ready to fight, became really central.
And politically, how did this ideal play out?
Well, Moss makes a powerful argument. He says this specific male ideal was absolutely crucial for the rise of fascism in the 20th century, especially National Socialism. He suggests it showed the tremendous possibilities inherent in modern masculinity when stripped for its warlike functions. It became this potent symbol of power, order, aggression.
And you can literally see that, can't you, in fascist art and architecture? Those sculptures by Arno Breker, like Bereitschaft or Der Sieger from 1939, and the Stadio dei Marmi in Rome.
Exactly. That stripped-down, hypermuscular, idealized male form. It's the visual language of that ideology.
But it wasn't always quite so straightforwardly embraced, this ideal. There was some nuance.
Definitely. History is rarely that simple. Take the earlier 18th century, for instance. Before these norms became quite so rigid, look at the letters between men like Pope and Bathurst, or Pope and Swift, Gray and Horace Walpole. The language is incredibly emotional, full of deep affection. Phrases like, "You are now the only man in the world who has cost me every day of my life a sigh." It suggests a very different atmosphere in male friendships back then, where expressing strong emotion wasn't necessarily taboo.
A cultivated emotionality.
Perhaps. And even in art, like Ingres' painting The Ambassadors of Agamemnon in the Tent of Achilles from 1801, there's an appreciation for male beauty and emotional depth that seems linked to those older classical ideals before things tightened up so much in the 19th century. And even later, there was pushback against certain kinds of male depiction. Richard Westmacott's Achilles statue in London from 1822 meant for Wellington. It got negative reactions. Someone called it a colossal Adonis, suggesting discomfort with maybe an overly aestheticized or soft male nude, even then, so the ideal was contested.
Fascinating. Okay, let's jump forward again, now to the mid-20th century. And wow, some of the views on sexuality then are just stark. We mentioned Krafft Ebing earlier, his 1886 view that a normal woman has little sensual desire. But then you have Dorothy Dunbar Bromley as late as 1954, saying she couldn't imagine a woman being aroused by a picture of a nude man.
It paints a picture of really profound repression, doesn't it? And Lord Cordell in 1953 adds to it. He asserts, "To be loved, to be desired, that is the desire of every normal woman," full stop. He also mentions men being repelled by menstruation, female body hair being a contradiction. And his take on female desire, it goes no further than these mild embraces until it's basically fed and developed by a knowledgeable male partner.
So female desire isn't innate. It has to be sort of cultivated or even created by men.
That's the strong implication. And it continues. Kenneth Walker and Peter Fletcher in 1955. They declare the sexual act for women isn't an end in itself, but just a means for the fulfillment of her biological role, that of fertility and motherhood. They even suggested women should learn from courtesans how to please their partners better.
Just incredible. And yet, amidst all this repression, you mentioned camping in films like Anchors Away from 1945. What was that about?
Camp. Loves exaggeration, irony, being theatrical. It often has this knowing wink, embracing artificiality, and through that, it could playfully subvert conventional gender roles and norms. So while these very rigid views dominated the mainstream, camp offered this subtle, often kind of queer-coded way to poke holes in it, all through performance and style.
A subtle resistance. But then the 1960s hit.
Oh, intensely so. You see it reflected in culture. Films like Splendor in the Grass from 1961. They offer this really poignant critique of society at the time, showing the struggle, particularly for the young woman, against that intense sexual repression, and highlighting the huge double standards, female virginity preserved for marriage at all costs, while male sexuality was treated much more leniently.
Such a stark picture. And things really started to change. The sexual revolution. The pill, obviously, was huge, monumental for female liberation. Though, as you said, some argued it also sort of contributed to the objectification of women, paradoxically.
A complex legacy, for sure. And then you get films like Deep Throat in 1972. Hugely controversial and often pointed to by feminists at the time as examples of media that just highlighted and reinforced unequal sexual power dynamics between men and women. But looking at the bigger picture, that whole period, say the 60s through the 90s, Jeffrey Weeks calls it a major historical transition in sexual belief and intimate behavior across the West, leading to, in his view, real progress, increased individual autonomy, freedom of choice, and more egalitarian relationship patterns.
A genuine paradigm shift. Stonewall, of course. David Carter, comparing it to the Bastille for gay liberation. That really captures its importance, doesn't it? A true starting point.
A pivotal moment, absolutely. Yeah. It really did dramatically alter the landscape for perceptions of sex and gender. And yet, even with these revolutions, these massive shifts, those old stereotypes, those ingrained roles, they persist, don't they? You can see it even in things like advertising from the late 19th century.
what a journey we've taken. We've held that historical mirror up and seen centuries of these evolving ideas about the body, gender, sexuality, and just how tangled up scientific understanding, cultural norms, and art have always been. From that ancient one-size model through gender play, gender panic, medicalization, it's so clear that our understanding is always shifting, always shaped by its time.
It really is. And it leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? How are our perceptions today, the ones we probably think are objective, based on science, how are they still being shaped by these invisible historical currents, by cultural stories, maybe even by those chemical wars still being debated in biology? What ingrained beliefs are we holding on to right now without even realizing their historical roots? And, what new mirrors might future generations hold up to us, showing us our own blind spots?
That's definitely something to think about. See you soon on From Opinion to Insight.